Hi, I'm Tim Ebringham. Welcome to today's session on building a full stack strategy, integrating strategy from business vision to tech execution. This is a presentation that I gave to the Bank IT conference in Toronto in 2016, and I think it's really relevant to a number of different industries, not just banking. Integrating strategy across your organization can create a competitive advantage that is sustainable. I always like to start with a great quote, and this is a great quote from Winston Churchill. However beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. This really speaks to the importance to me of measuring how your strategic planning process is working. If you don't have metrics and measurements in place, how do you know if you're being successful in your strategic roadmap? In order to understand strategy, let's take a look at how strategy looks in many organizations. It's built from the top down, starting with the enterprise strategy, and then being pushed to all of the various business groups, product groups, sales teams, and technology groups. All of the enterprise priorities are pushed from the top down. Individual supporting teams then overlay their own priorities into that strategy to develop their own. There's very limited collaboration between those supporting teams, and there's no feedback loop or measurement. What you wind up seeing is a corporate strategy, business unit strategies, and individual strategies that underlie them that are very silo oriented and disconnected. Pushing a top down strategy actually drives disconnected behaviors and limited results. The annual cycle of set it and forget it results in limited monitoring of progress, and nobody ever goes back to see how we did. Individual teams have limited motivation to align to the enterprise or to other teams' priorities. There's no ability to course correct if an individual strategy isn't succeeding. And there's no accountability between teams to build and maintain an aligned and consistent strategic plan. So, how do you solve for that? Strategy needs to be interconnected as a stack. Everything needs to start with the focus of the business, which should be articulated in terms of brand, vision, and values. The enterprise business strategy has to integrate across all of the supporting teams and business units. Each layer breaks down and builds on the layer above it and fully consumes the layer below it. Alignment needs to be driven top down and bottom up to create a holistic strategic view. One note here for technologists: technology can influence the capabilities and the business strategy, but it cannot drive it all the way to the top of the stack. Unless your business is technology, the business needs to drive the strategy of the organization. My solution would be to create an aligned strategy, and I use a multi-dimensional strategy cube to accomplish that. So in order to maximize the value of the strategic plan and all of the roadmaps that it encompasses, the strategy needs to be developed in a linked and expansive way to enable looking at it through some key different lenses. Some examples of those would be business activity, if you look at the service model of your organization, organizational structure by line of business or geography in which where you play, architecture and platform, either from a business architecture and platform or a technology architecture and platform standpoint, customer experience dimensions, market differentiation, your innovation portfolio, is it disruptive or incremental, or others that may be defined that suit your own business better. With a comprehensive and linked set of strategies, we can effectively use these roadmaps to set cross-organizational priorities on a regular basis. One sample dimension that I called out was service model. In banking, you can quickly leverage the banking industry architecture network model and identify horizons, individual horizons and segments, which can be drawn together that have similar supporting business and technology capabilities. Another dimension to look at is customer experience. Strategy components should include a high-level journey map to customer experience impacts, and they should leverage a common set of personas and standard set of key moments, which can be tracked across strategies and services to find common initiatives. You should also be looking at the innovation profile so that you can map and pull your levers appropriately. Is this incremental, disruptive, breakthrough, or a game changer? You can also look at where the idea falls along the commercialization portfolio. So how do you actually build this cube? Well, the enterprise and the team have their own set of responsibilities. At the enterprise level, you need to define the appropriate cube dimensions and measurements. Metrics are very important in this process, and it's important to look at the measurements for each of your dimensions so that you can go back and check your progress later. You need to assess the market and enterprise strategic priorities. What's happening in your industry or in your business where you need to be making changes or prioritizing certain work? You need to determine the relative importance of those dimensions given the enterprise needs. You're not going to necessarily prioritize revenue growth and cost savings and innovation across exactly the same weighting. What's most important given the landscape today? You need to integrate and validate the individual strategic priorities you receive from the team into the cubes. Each of the teams are going to provide you their own priorities and roadmap. You need to be able to pull them all together, and it is an enterprise accountability to actually integrate those ideas. And finally, the enterprise needs to communicate the integrated strategic roadmap and plan to all stakeholders. They have a unique perspective coming from the top down to be able to show each of those groups how their ideas and their priorities fit into the enterprise. At a team level, you need to identify and submit individual team strategic priorities. These are the things that are really critical for your particular part of the organization. You need to support the categorization of each of those priorities against the cube dimensions. So looking at the priorities and the dimensions which the enterprise has determined are important, you need to accurately and transparently categorize your own priorities against those dimensions. You need to be willing to collaborate with the enterprise and with other teams when similar priorities are identified. If you and three other teams are looking for the same type of capability, it is important for you to all work together to find the best and most efficient way to implement it. You need to provide clear and transparent projections for targets against the strategic dimensions and measurements. Set realistic goals and be honest about what you're going to achieve, understanding that the enterprise will now be measuring these. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, you need to assign clear ownership to each strategic priority. I personally like to see one name who holds accountability for driving that priority forward. Once you've built the cube, it has incredible power. Each individual team can now submit their own strategic priorities up the stack, rather than overlaying them over what they receive from the top down. Common or similar priorities between teams are quickly identified at higher levels and can be integrated into a common roadmap item. Enterprise priorities and the roadmap can be set by rotating the cube to focus on one or more dimensions. You can also think of this as pulling the levers of those dimensions based on the priorities and the evolving marketplace. Teams in the enterprise become connected. And communicating the priorities simplifies, and individual teams can quickly see how their work aligns to the organization and the priorities of the enterprise. Finally, and I think this is most critical, you can measure progress along the cube's dimensions. If you set your priorities in a certain way at the outset of the year, you can very quickly see how you're progressing each month along the way, and then make course corrections and tweak and change your roadmap in the short term to achieve your longer term goals. So how does that picture look now that we've got that interconnected stack? The enterprise strategy now encompasses each of the unit strategies, whether it be the business unit, the product strategy, the sales strategy, and there's actually overlap between each of those teams. The priorities are aligned across the enterprise. There's a holistic strategy that integrates all the individual team priorities. There's an enforced collaboration and alignment between each of the teams. And there is simple metrics-based measurement and feedback that can inform the adjustments that are necessary to be successful through a year. There's lots of different ways to think about measuring execution and driving accountability through this integration. This is a framework that I found from Optimus SBR Consulting, looking at accountability framework where you can look at the responsibilities and needs of the organization and as well at the individual level. There are a number of different models and frameworks you can use to implement your measures. This is an example that I find to be quite simple. So this has been a quick primer on how I use the interconnected strategy cube to drive an integrated strategy across the organization. I would be very happy to discuss how this concept could be used in your organization. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the concept or would like to explore how you can build a smarter strategy for your organization going forward. Thank you very much.